They said the plague came from the east, riding the silk roads and the spice roads, tucked into the saddlebags of merchants and the wool of trading ships. It arrived in Messina, Sicily, in October of 1347, carried by Genoese galleys fleeing a Tartar siege at Kaffa. The men who stumbled onto the docks were alive, but already claimed, their bodies mapped with black swellings the size of eggs, their breath a foul river. The Sicilians met them with stones and fire, but the rats had already gone ashore. It moved through the body like a siege. It began quietly, a small chink in the wall, perhaps a shiver, a heaviness in the limbs, the kind of tired that sleep cannot mend. Then came the fever, a dry and desperate heat that seemed to come from the marrow itself. The victims spoke of a thirst that water could not reach, a deep interior drought. And then the gifts from God, the buboes. They rose in the soft places, the groin, the armpit, the curve of the neck-hard knots of ruined flesh, some the size of almonds, some the size of apples. Some were solitary, some clustered like grapes. They burned, they blackened. When they burst, they released a stench so profound that even mothers fled from their children. For some, the death was quick, a matter of hours. For others, it lingered 3 days, sometimes 5, a slow retreat from the world. Toward the end, some coughed blood, great gouts of it, bright and arterial. And this was the surest sign that the soul was already gone and the body merely catching up. In the final hours, spots appeared on the skin, black or livid, scattered like coins, the signature of the plague, the seal upon the covenant of death. There was no pattern to whom it took, or perhaps the pattern was simply too large to see. It took the infant at the breast, and the nun who had never touched a man. It took the bishop who anointed the dying and the gravedigger who buried them. It took the usurer and the beggar, the lord in his keep and the serf in his hovel. It took the just and the wicked, the prepared and the terrified, the ones who prayed and the ones who cursed. It took them in the streets and in their beds, at the altar rail and at the plow, in the act of love and in the act of flight. It seemed, at times, to take them for no reason at all. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio watched his city collapse and later wrote it down, because someone had to remember what it was like. He described how the healthy sickened and died in the time it took to walk from one end of the street to the other. How men who had amassed great fortunes died without heirs, their wealth unclaimed, their mansions left to servants who sometimes survived long enough to spend it. How the dead were stacked like cordwood in the churches, until the churches overflowed, and then they were stacked in the piazzas. And then they were thrown into common pits, layer upon layer like lasagna, the gravediggers covering each tier with a thin dusting of earth until the next cart arrived. He wrote of the pigs. In the early days, people thought the plague was airborne, a miasma, a corruption of the atmosphere, and so they burned sweet herbs and carried posies and sealed their windows against the bad air. But the pigs knew. A drove of them, rooting in the street, came upon the rags of a poor man who had died unshriven, his body already taken to the pit, but his clothing left behind. The pigs tore the rags with their teeth and rooted among them, and within the hour they were twisting on the ground, their bodies convulsing, their snouts blackening. The plague did not travel through air. It traveled through touch. It traveled through fleas, through rats, through the breath of the dying, through the hands of the living who tried to close their eyes. It traveled through love. Those who could flee did so. The rich retreated to their country villas, bringing with them musicians and wine, determined to wait out the pestilence in pleasure rather than prayer. They formed small, exclusive compounds, admitting no one from the outside, accepting deliveries only after 3 days of quarantine. Some survived. Most did not, because they brought their servants, and their servants brought the plague, and the plague brought the reckoning. In Siena, Agnolo di Tura buried his wife and his children with his own hands, 5 of them in 8 days, and wrote in his chronicle, *And I, Adnolo buried my 5 children with my own hands, and many others there were who covered their dead with a little earth and died themselves. And there was no one to mourn the dead, because everyone awaited death. Asterisk, the living avoided the living. In Avignon, Pope Clement VI sat between 2 great fires, even in the summer heat, because it was believed that fire purified the air. He refused to grant audiences, refused to touch the hands extended toward him, refused to anoint the dying with his own sacred oils. He survived. In Paris, the physicians wore beaked masks stuffed with herbs, the glass eyes staring out at a world they could no longer touch. They carried long wooden canes to examine patients without coming near them, to lift a gown or turn a limb. They bled the sick and purged them, and applied dried toads to the buboes, because the toads were believed to draw out the poison. The patients died anyway. The physicians died anyway. The masks and the herbs and the toads, they died too. In the villages, they tried other remedies. In some places, they fasted and processed, walking barefoot through the streets with ropes around their necks, beating their breasts, crying out for mercy. In others, they scourged themselves, bands of flagellants moving from town to town, their backs laid open by leather thongs tipped with iron spikes, their blood marking the cobblestones. They sang hymns of repentance and denounced the clergy who had fled their parishes. They said the plague was God's punishment for the wickedness of the world, and that only through suffering could the world be saved. The church condemned them. The plague killed them anyway. Some said the Jews had poisoned the wells. The rumor spread from Spain to Germany, from Germany to Switzerland, from Switzerland to France, a contagion faster than the plague itself. In Strasbourg, the citizens herded 2,000 Jews onto a wooden platform and burned them alive. In Basel, they locked them in a wooden barn and set it alight. In Mainz, 6,000 were slaughtered. The Jews died proclaiming the unity of God, and the plague continued. It did not abate. It did not acknowledge the sacrifice. It did not care. And still the dead accumulated. The chroniclers struggled to count them, because the numbers became abstractions, mere figures, and the figures became meaningless. In Florence, 100,000. In Venice, 100,000. In Paris, 50,000. In London, half the population. In Hamburg, 2/3. In Avignon, 60,000 in 7 months. In Cairo, 7,000 a day at the peak. In Damascus, 2,400 in a single night. In Beijing, whole districts emptied. In Persia, entire villages abandoned. The numbers grew so large that they ceased to convey meaning, became merely a kind of incantation, a desperate attempt to impose order upon chaos. But the individual deaths were not abstractions. Each one was a world ending. Each one was a mother who would never again feel the weight of her child in her arms, a father who would not see his son's wedding, a bride whose groom never arrived, a merchant whose ship would wait forever at the wharf, a priest who died before he could make his own confession, a child who called out in the night for a mother who would not come. Each one was a story unfinished, a song unsung, a harvest unplanted, a book unread, a debt unpaid, a sin unforgiven. Each one was a name scratched into a register or carved into stone or simply forgotten, carried away in the cart and tumbled into the pit, anonymous, unmarked, unknown. They were not unknown to God, the priests said. But the priests were dying too. In October of 1348, the plague reached England. It arrived in Melcombe Regis, Dorset, aboard another ship from Gascony. The sailors were already dead at their oars. The rats came ashore, and the plague followed. By November, it was in London. The king fled to Windsor, then to Oxford, then to a succession of manors, never staying more than a few days in any one place. The court followed him, and the plague followed the court. Parliament was prorogued. The law courts closed. The great machinery of government ground to a halt, because there was no one left to operate it. The sheriffs were dead. The justices were dead. The clerks who kept the rolls were dead or dying, their ink pots dry, their parchment untouched. The Archbishop of Canterbury died. His successor died. His successor's successor died. 3 archbishops in a single year, the mitre passing from corpse to corpse, like a hot coal no one could hold. In Norwich, the bishop died. In Winchester, the bishop died. In Ely, the bishop died. In Worcester, the bishop died. In Hereford, the bishop died. In Bath and Wells, the bishop died. In Exeter, the bishop died. In Llandaff, the bishop died. In St. David's, the bishop died. In Bangor, the bishop died. The church, which had promised to endure until the end of time, was losing its shepherds faster than it could ordain new ones. In some dioceses, they ordained boys who could barely read the Latin of the Mass. In others, they ordained no one at all, and monasteries emptied. At Canterbury, 80 monks died. At St. Albans, 47. At Croxton, the entire community perished. The monks who survived fled, or they stayed and prayed, or they stayed and died. Their chronicles break off mid-sentence. The pen dropped from a dead hand, the last entry describing the progress of the disease through the dormitory, through the refectory, through the infirmary, through the chapel. Asterisk, and on the 3rd day of November Brother Thomas died, and on the 4th Brother William, and on the 5th Brother John, and on the 6th Brother Richard, and on the 7th I began to feel the swelling in my neck, and I commend my soul to God, and I ask whoever reads this to pray for me, because I do not think I will finish this page. Asterisk, they did not finish. The villagers died too. In the little hamlet of Tilbury, Essex, the reeve kept a tally of his neighbors. John Ada Wode, dead. Agnes, his wife, dead. Their 3 children, dead. William Smith, dead. Marjorie, his wife, sick. Thomas Carpenter, dead. Joan, his mother, dead. Simon the shepherd fled. His sheep, wandering the common, untended. The tally went on for 2 pages, then 3, then 4, then stopped. The reeve himself died on the 5th page, his last entry a trembling scrawl. Asterisk, I have the swelling in my left arm. God have mercy on my soul. Asterisk, God may have had mercy. The plague did not. In the spring of 1349, the weather turned cold and wet, and some said the pestilence was abating. In some places, it was. In others, it was merely pausing, gathering itself for another assault. It swept northward into Scotland, where the Scots had boasted that God would spare them because of their righteousness, and where they had assembled an army to invade England, while the English were weak. The plague met them at the border, and scattered them like chaff. It swept westward into Wales, where the bards sang laments for princes who had died centuries before, and where the living now died without songs. It swept across the Irish Sea into Dublin, where the Archbishop perished, and into the countryside, where the Gaelic lords died beside the Anglo-Norman settlers, their ancient enmity rendered meaningless by the common enemy. In Ireland, a Franciscan friar recorded the desolation. Asterisk, between March and August, 5,000 people died in the Diocese of Meath, and many others elsewhere. They died in their houses and in the fields, and the cattle wandered without herdsmen, and the crops rotted in the ground, and there was no one to harvest them. The plague left scarcely a fourth of the population alive. Asterisk, in England, a chronicler wrote simply, asterisk, the sheep and cattle strayed through the fields and among the crops, and there were none to drive them away. Asterisk, the harvests failed, not because the weather was bad, though it was, those cold, wet springs, but because there was no one to bring in the grain. The scythes lay rusting in the barns. The oxen stood unyoked in the meadows. The wheat ripened and fell and rotted in the mud, and the surviving peasants, their numbers too few to work the land, watched the winter approach with empty granaries and empty bellies. In some places, they ate the seed corn, knowing it meant no planting in the spring, but preferring survival now to hope for later. In other places, they died anyway. The lords who survived found themselves masters of empty manors. Their tenants were dead, their fields fallow, their rents uncollected, their authority meaningless. They offered higher wages to attract workers, but the workers who remained demanded more than wages. They demanded freedom, the right to leave the manor and sell their labor where it was most valued. The lords refused, then relented, then refused again, then passed laws to compel the peasants to work for pre-plague wages. The peasants ignored the laws. They had buried their wives and children. They had seen the mighty fall and the humble rise. They had walked through the valley of the shadow and emerged on the other side. They were no longer afraid. The plague, which had destroyed so much, had also destroyed the old certainties. Before the pestilence, a serf was a serf, bound to the soil, subject to his lord, his life circumscribed by custom and law and the will of God. After the pestilence, a serf was a man who could walk away, could find employment in another village, another county, another life. The lords called it theft and prosecuted the fugitives. The courts, when they functioned, ordered them returned. But there were not enough courts, not enough lords, not enough men to enforce the judgments. The old world was dying, and the new world was not yet born, and in the space between, the peasants moved as they wished, as the plague had moved, without regard for boundaries. In the cities, the guilds lost their masters and took on new ones, the sons of laborers sitting in chairs once occupied by the sons of merchants. In the universities, the scholars died at their desks and were replaced by boys who had learned their letters in parish schools, their grammar imperfect, their Latin accented, their minds hungry. In the church, the priests who survived were often those who had fled their flocks, and their parishes did not forget. New heresies sprouted in the fertile soil of disillusionment. Lollardy in England, Hussitism in Bohemia, 1,000 local movements that questioned the authority of a clergy that had failed to save them. The plague did not cause these movements, but it cleared the ground for them, pulling up the old roots and leaving the earth exposed. The plague also created saints. In Siena, Saint Catherine was born in 1347, the 23rd child of a dyer, a twin who survived the pestilence that took her sister. She grew to womanhood in a city half empty, surrounded by the memory of death, and she devoted her life to the sick and the poor, ministering to plague victims in the hospitals, carrying their dying confessions to the priests. She saw visions and performed miracles, and dictated letters to popes and kings. And when she died at 33, the people of Siena called her saint. She was one of the survivors, one of those who had walked through the fire and emerged not unscathed, but alight. In Florence, the survivors emerged into a city transformed. The great families had been decimated. The Medici, who would later rule the city, were still obscure wool merchants. The Palazzo della Signoria stood empty, its officials dead or fled. The streets, once crowded with merchants and artisans and pilgrims, were quiet, the shops shuttered, the workshops silent. Boccaccio walked through these empty streets and remembered the city as it had been before the plague, a city of noise and color and life, and he wrote his asterisk Decameron asterisk, a collection of stories told by 10 young people who had fled the pestilence to wait out its passing in a country villa. They told tales of love and trickery and fortune, of the cunning and the foolish, the faithful and the faithless. They laughed in his book, and they survived, and they returned to Florence when the plague had done its worst and moved on. Boccaccio knew, as his readers knew, that these survivors were the lucky ones, and that their laughter was a form of defiance, a refusal to be defined by the catastrophe they had witnessed. By 1351, the plague had burned through Europe and the Middle East and North Africa, and it was spent. It had killed perhaps 50 million people more than a third of the population of Europe, similar proportions in the Middle East, unknown numbers in Asia. It had destroyed dynasties and emptied cities and transformed the balance of power between lords and peasants, between faith and doubt, between the living and the dead. It had left in its wake a world diminished but also altered, the old structures weakened, the old certainties shaken. But the plague did not leave. It settled into the walls and the floorboards, into the fur of rats and the blood of fleas, into the lungs of the living and the marrow of the dead. It would return in 1361, killing the children who had been born since the last visitation, the ones who had no immunity and no memory. It would return in 1369, and in 1374, and in 1381, and in 1390, and again for the next 3 centuries. A recurrent fever in the body of Europe, flaring and subsiding and flaring again. It would never fully go away. It would become part of the landscape, a fact of life, like winter and war and the will of God. In the years after the first great mortality, the survivors tried to make sense of what had happened. They blamed the Jews and the lepers and the foreigners and the sins of the world. They prayed and processed and scourged themselves and paid for masses and built chantries and endowed hospitals and gave alms to the poor. They sought patterns in the stars and signs in the entrails of birds and meanings in the pages of Scripture. They wrote chronicles and poems and sermons and treatises, trying to capture in words something that had no precedent, no parallel, no adequate comparison. They said it was like the flood, like the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, like the 10 plagues of Egypt. They said it was the end of the world, and when the world did not end, they said it was a judgment, a purification, a mystery. Imagine a world where a mysterious illness could wipe out nearly half the population of an entire continent in just a few years. It sounds like science fiction, but this was the reality of the 14th century. This is the story of the Black Death, one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, and how it reshaped our world in ways we still feel today. It all began in the 1340s. Somewhere in Central or East Asia, a bacterium called Yersinia pestis found a new host in fleas living on black rats. These rats were expert travelers, hitching rides on merchant caravans and ships along the bustling Silk Road. By 1347, the plague had reached the shores of Europe, arriving at the Sicilian port of Messina. Sailors aboard the trading ships were either already dead or gravely ill, covered in strange black boils that gave the disease its terrifying name, the Black Death. From Sicily, it was a wildfire. The plague spread with horrifying speed across Italy, then to France, Spain, England, and Germany. Within 5 years, it had engulfed almost all of Europe. The symptoms were gruesome and swift. Victims suffered from fever, chills, vomiting, and agonizing pain. The most infamous sign was the appearance of buboes swollen, painful lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, or neck that would turn black as the tissue died. For most, death was almost a certainty, often coming within a week. The world of the 14th century was completely unprepared. Medical knowledge was limited, and people had no concept of germs or viruses. They looked for answers everywhere. Some blamed alignments of the planets. Others believed it was a punishment from God for humanity's sins. Desperate theories led to desperate measures. People tried everything from bathing in vinegar and rosewater to carrying sweet-smelling flowers, hoping to ward off the bad air they believed carried the disease. In some cities, authorities sealed the sick inside their own homes, leaving them to their fate. None of it worked. The death toll was staggering. Historians estimate that the Black Death claimed the lives of 30 to 60% of Europe's population, somewhere between 75 and 200 million people worldwide. Entire villages were wiped off the map. Cities were left half empty. The social fabric of society was torn apart. Imagine the psychological impact. Life was filled with constant fear and grief. People were terrified of their own neighbors, their own family members. Priests who were on the front lines providing last rites died in huge numbers. The sheer scale of death overwhelmed the living. Mass graves were dug to accommodate the endless stream of bodies. Daily life came to a standstill. With so many farmers and laborers gone, fields were left unplowed and crops unharvested, leading to widespread famine. But in the midst of all this destruction, something unexpected happened. The world began to change. With so many people gone, the old feudal system, which had dominated Europe for centuries, started to crumble. Suddenly, there was a severe labor shortage. For the first time, peasants and workers who survived found themselves in a position of power. They could demand higher wages and better working conditions. Many left their rural manors for the cities, seeking new opportunities. This massive social and economic shift helped lay the groundwork for the end of serfdom in Western Europe. The Church, which had been the unshakable center of medieval life, also saw its authority questioned. Its inability to stop the plague or offer a convincing explanation shook people's faith. This growing skepticism and questioning of traditional authority would eventually contribute to the intellectual currents that led to the Renaissance and the Reformation. The Black Death also spurred innovation. The need to understand the human body and disease led to advances in medicine and public health. Cities began to create health boards and quarantine measures, early attempts at controlling the spread of epidemics. Doctors started performing more autopsies, seeking to understand what was happening inside the body. While their immediate understanding was limited, it was a crucial step toward modern medical science. So, is the Black Death just a dark chapter in a history book? Not at all. The plague didn't just disappear after the 1350s. It returned in waves for centuries, though never with the same ferocity as the initial outbreak. And Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible, still exists today. Thankfully, we now have antibiotics, which can effectively treat the plague if caught early. Modern sanitation and public health measures also mean that large-scale pandemics of this nature are highly unlikely. But the legacy of the Black Death is about more than just a disease. It's a powerful reminder of humanity's vulnerability, but also our incredible resilience. It shows how a single crisis can completely reorder society, economics, and even our most deeply held beliefs. It accelerated the end of the Middle Ages and helped usher in the modern world. The world we live in today was, in many ways, forged in the crucible of that terrible pandemic. It is a somber but fascinating lesson on how even the darkest moments in history can lead to profound and lasting change. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey into the past interesting, please hit the like button. Subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history, and let us know in the comments what historical event you'd like us to cover next. See you in the next video.